It has now been 10 years since the release of X-Men Days of Future Past, one of my favourite superhero movies of all time. So today I'm here to stop and rank every X-Men movie, ranked from worst to best. Yes, including the Deadpool movies. And yes, 10 years went way too fast. So let's go. And as a quick point of reference, the New Mutants is not on my list because this pure abomination does nothing but disrespects the X-Men. So now let's get into the real ranking. Kicking off the list and easily coming in last place for me, X-Men Dark Phoenix from 2019, and this was by far the worst way to say farewell to the original timeline for our X-Men. Terrible choices, a weird ending that leaves it on a cliffhanger, but because the movie did so terrible, they just left the universe as it is. I don't recommend seeing this movie, and it easily comes in last. Up next is a lot of people's least favourite, X-Men Origins Wolverine, and the only reason this isn't in last place is because one of my hottest takes ever. I like the chemistry between Logan and Kayla Silverfox, a lot of people's forgotten character. However, the soundtrack is also great here, and Deadpool absolutely does no favours, that's why it's so low. Kicking off the top 10 is X-Men Apocalypse, and this timeline easily gives me my favourite character in the universe, other than Logan, because he's tied. Magneto is the shining star of this movie, and Apocalypse is the big problem in this one. A very messy timeline and a great story handled poorly. Number 9 for me is a movie that could have been cut by at least half an hour and still been decent, X-Men The Last Stand, the original ending to the old timeline, where it leaves on a bunch of cliffhangers, and again, this is another movie that did terrible, and it doesn't leave a lot to be desired. I do think this movie is overhated. It's a great movie, it's not that terrible, but it's not also a shining star in the franchise. I'm glad this later gets retconned into a better ending. And here we go with the controversial hot takes. Deadpool 2 at number 8 for me. Look, this movie is not bad at all. It's a fairly decent movie. However, what makes it suffer for me is the whole jump in between two timelines. And Cable is a good villain, perhaps one of the best in the X-Men franchise, but it just suffers a lot for me. The whole introducing new characters but killing them off very easy. Not as good as the original, also not a terrible sequel. Number 7, and a underrated gem in my opinion of this franchise, The Wolverine. Now this easily clears X-Men Origins, as you can see from the list so far. This is so good. The action, the set piece, the fact that it's set in Japan, and Hugh Jackman just knocks this out of the park. Heavily underrated, a little overhated in my opinion, and a decent movie all around. Number 6 is going to Logan. Now, my favourite character, Wolverine, will be making his return in Deadpool 3 very, very soon. However, this was the perfect ending at the time to his trilogy and his story. This had the right amount of action and the perfect storytelling between old and new characters. Charles Xavier finally dying feels right for the timeline, and I can't wait to see where they go with Deadpool 3 and if they somehow retcon this movie. Before we get into our top 5, I'm just going to throw this one in here real quick. Once Upon a Deadpool, a fun alternate version of Deadpool 2, which was kind of a saving grace for me because I never got to watch Deadpool 2 in cinemas. This is definitely a more fun version of the movie, but I'm also sure Ryan Reynolds committed kidnapping. Didn't he kidnap the director of this film? Heading into our top 5 is Deadpool, the most anticipated superhero movie of all time at that point, where the character was purely wasted in X-Men Origins Wolverine. However, this movie not only retconned the character, but the style of the character, making this a damn near perfect movie, a great origin story, a good start to a very good character, and a movie where it can literally lead to anything, as we see in Deadpool 3, which I'm super excited for. Number 4 is the one that started it all, X-Men, the original movie, which introduced great characters, a great story, a phenomenal plotline that still carries on 25 years later, spanning across 50 plus years. As I said, great characters introduced. My favourite Wolverine, still my favourite since I've seen this movie, and a great starting to a great franchise. Kicking off our top three, X2, otherwise known as X-Men 2, X-Men United, where this movie outdoes its predecessor, somehow one of the very rare superhero movies where the sequel is better than the first. This movie just carries on everything, carries it over to a sequel, and makes it what the first should have been, a perfect sequel, setting the way and setting the path for future superhero movies to come. Wolverine is great as usual. Storm really takes a strong lead in here. Magneto and Professor X dueling it out for an entire 2 hours. That movie is simply phenomenal. Our runner-up, X-Men First Class. A movie where when it was announced that it would be on a new timeline, people were very skeptical about, and this movie just proved everybody wrong. Phenomenal soundtrack, a great character, a great cast. Everyone cast here seems perfect in my opinion, especially Michael Fassbender as a young Magneto. The reason this movie places very high for me is simply because the soundtrack is so great in this. Many superhero movies have great soundtracks that don't exactly fit characters. However, Magneto's, titled Frankenstein's Monster, is my favourite superhero theme of all time. A spy thriller that blew it out the park, and this movie is such a good one. And coming in at number one, 10 years to the day we are here, X-Men Days of Future Past. Now, the writers took one of the most riskiest moves seen in cinema to bridge the two timelines together, and they pulled it off perfectly, bridging the two old and new timelines to bring every character in X-Men movie history together for 2.5 hours, making Wolverine go back 50 years in time to retcon everything. Where all hope seems lost, he manages to do the impossible and wakes up in a time where everything seems hopeful again. 10 years later, this is still my favourite X-Men movie. There have been many contenders and runner-ups for it. However, like I said, a whole decade, this movie is perfect.